Later this month, Trump is heading to Paris for Bastille Day of all days. His most significant act so far is announcing the United States is going to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement. Where do we go from here?
If there is any good news here, and I don't want to spin this as good news because obviously it is bad news when the world's largest economy backs out of an agreement that was, though inadequate, the best we've managed to get in more than a quarter century of climate negotiations. It's because he claims he's going to get a better deal. Obviously, that's not good news, but if there is good news, it's that Americans don't actually get their energy from Washington. You know, they get it at the city level, they get it at the state level. Really key decisions are made at the subnational level in the United States. There are certainly all kinds of things that a federal government can do and should be doing to accelerate a transition off of fossil fuels to renewables, and there's lots of things they can do to get in the way, and Trump is basically doing all of those things. But we've seen large states like California and New York increase their ambitions. We've seen mayors of large cities step up and make very bold commitments in direct response to Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Accord, like the mayor of Pittsburgh, who Trump invoked when he announced the withdrawal. Mayor of Pittsburgh stepping up and saying, we're going to get our city to 100% renewable energy by 2035, which is really the most ambitious target in the country, and really what we need to be seeing from countries around the world. So if the response to Trump's Paris withdrawal is more ambition, and as well it should be, then all is not lost. I think we need to understand that Trump himself, as well as many of the people he's surrounded himself with, really understand how to benefit from crises and shocks. This is how he entered into the Manhattan real estate industry, and then you've got his Treasury Secretary, Steve Mnuchin, who profited extravagantly from the 2008 subprime mortgage crisis, bought a bank which specialized in foreclosing on people's homes and profiting from that. 5 former Goldman Sachs executives are in his cabinet, and we know that Goldman Sachs has faced enormous fines for the way in which it profited off the 2008 financial crisis. And then, Rex Tillerson, his Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, which is a company that certainly knows how to profit from crisis, from war. They profited from the invasion of Iraq, made oil deals in Iraqi Kurdistan. Also, when the invasion of Iraq led to the price of oil spiking, they went into the Alberta tar sands, made more profits than any company has ever recorded in this period. I believe $42 billion in profits in a single year is quite a record.
And Mike Pence as well, the Republican Study Committee, was very influential along with the Heritage Foundation in New Orleans. And you call New Orleans the blueprint of disaster capitalism.
Yeah, I mean, this is why I call the disaster capitalism cabinet. Some people have responded to the book saying, well, Trump is an idiot, he can't possibly have any kind of strategy here. But if you look at who he has surrounded himself with, there is this pattern of understanding the utility of crisis. And I think some of the people he has surrounded himself with are not stupid at all. Mike Pence was chair of the Republican Study Group when Katrina hit New Orleans. And he chaired a meeting at the Heritage Foundation in 2005 while New Orleans was still underwater. This is just less than 2 weeks after the levees broke. And they came up with a wish list of policies to push through while New Orleans residents were scattered throughout the country and were not able to protect their interests, to privatize the school system, to get rid of public housing, to create what they called a tax-free free enterprise zone, sort of like a Wild West for developers and contractors to come in and rapidly gentrify New Orleans. Really a brutal process, and Pence was right at the dead center of it.
And Steve Bannon as well. You include a really fascinating quote you said in February 2017 that the goal is the deconstruction of the administrative state. If you look at these cabinet nominees, they were selected for a reason, and that reason is deconstruction. What would deconstruction look like in the US?
Well, I mean, one of the first announcements that Trump made was that he was going to cut regulation by 75%. the other day he had a press conference where he hurled a few environmental assessment reports off the table, right, calling it red tape. And, you know, speaking to you here in London, just a couple of weeks after the Grenfell Tower disaster, it's a reminder of the enormous human stakes in an act like that, right? Of just of treating the laws, the regulations that are designed to keep us safe. This happened just as Trump was making the Paris announcement, the withdrawal from the Paris Accord. His Commerce Secretary, Wilbur Ross, was addressing an audience of business leaders, and he was reassuring them that he was going to be renegotiating the North American Free Trade Agreement using the best practices of the TPP, of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which Trump campaigned against, right? I mean, so much of what he's doing on economic policy is exactly the opposite of what he campaigned on, right? He campaigned it was a very xenophobic campaign, as we know, a very racist campaign, but it was an anti-neoliberal campaign. He promised to protect Social Security, that everybody would be covered under his health care plan. This is not the way Republicans usually run, and he promised to renegotiate NAFTA for what he called fair trade. He actually used the phrase fair trade, and now it turns out that he's going to be renegotiating these agreements to make them even more aggressively pro-corporate. This is something that Sanders and Corbyn kind of have in common, is that their careers have been consistent enough that they are trusted messengers for a transformational agenda.
You say that the president is the personification of the merger between humans and corporations, a one-man mega brand. And he's less an aberration than a logical conclusion. This will surprise a lot of people. What exactly do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, we're in entirely new territory with Trump, right? I mean, there have been U.S. presidents that had business interests that didn't divest, but Trump's business is not a normal business. It is a business that is built entirely around his personality, his persona. He has merged his self, his personhood, with this corporation, the Trump Organization, and the business model of the Trump Organization is not to build buildings and sell condominiums or office space. That used to be the business model, but now the business model is to build the Trump name. That's the primary thing that Trump builds is the word Trump and attaching all of this meaning and prestige around it, and then his business model is to sell that name to developers around the world so that they build the buildings and take on all of the risk. And the buildings can completely fail, and Trump doesn't lose anything. He's licensed his name. And he has taught his children to do the same. He breeds brands. Ivanka, his daughter, who he brought into his business at a very, very early age, got this huge platform as a co-star of The Apprentice, now has her own brand. And these brands, I think it's hard to even when we hear these discussions. I mean, is Trump going to divest? It's so much more complicated than that, because Donald Trump is, even as he is U.S. president, there are these avatars of Donald Trump and of Ivanka Trump being out there selling golf courses and condominiums and spa services and bottled water and this, we're in this kind of commercial house of mirrors with this first family of brands. And of course, they are profiting in countless ways from the presidency because the centerpiece of Trump's promise of his brand is selling this idea of absolute power through wealth, being the boss. That's his brand, living this dream. So, of course, being the president bolsters that so much. I mean, this is the ultimate brand extension. So he's able to double the fees at Mar-a-Lago. Sales of Ivanka's brands is increasing. They're doing very well. They're launching a whole new line of hotels in the United States, or two new hotel lines. One's called American Ideal, and it's a brand that is specifically targeted to his middle-class base, because of course most of Trump's developments, or all of Trump's developments to date, are more for the luxury market, right? So most of his voters can't actually buy Trump condominiums or afford the $200,000 membership fees at Mar-a-Lago. And the Trump sons realized was, a terrible missed marketing opportunity. So now they've launched a line of hotels that's more in the Holiday Inn bracket, a 3-star hotel, and they're going to cash in on the Make America Great market.
The CEO of CBS News said infamously of their coverage, and CBS, of course, was once the gold standard for news, he said, it may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS. How complicit are those major networks? And as a corollary of that, how important is the independent media?
Yeah. So I would say incredibly complicit, and the crime is ongoing. It did not end. There was no wake-up call, even though there were these mea culpas after the election. You heard from the head of CNN, Jeff Zucker, that maybe we shouldn't have just had our cameras trained on an empty podium for an hour waiting for Trump to show up. Maybe there should have covered the other candidates a little bit more, and perhaps Trump wouldn't have won. But I think Trump is an addiction for cable news, for all of commercial news. It's like he's crack. They can't look away from him because they've never had ratings like this. They've never had clicks like this. And so even though there were these mea culpas of, oh, well, we shouldn't have given him this outsized coverage, the addiction now is the Trump show. And it is still coming at the expense of coverage of the issues, of other issues. So I'm not saying Russia's not an issue, but it is taking about 95% of the oxygen on cable news because it fits this reality TV show narrative that is so good for ratings. He fired Comey. Is he going to fire Mueller? Is he going to fire what's happening with Jared? The palace intrigue. Is Trump himself going to be voted off the island? I mean, find out after these commercials. Like that is ratings gold, and so it is so addictive that the fact that he's dismantling the financial regulations that were imposed after 2008, what he's doing with healthcare, what he's doing with Social Security, the outrageous tax giveaways that are happening, 15% corporate tax, getting rid of the estate tax, which is all about benefiting the super rich. These are footnotes to the coverage.
And the book's called No Is Not Enough, and you challenge the idea that we require only resistance rather than also offering what you call a different story, a different path, a vision for those who are hurting. And you speak about the need to fight defence and attack simultaneously, to say no and yes at the same time. Mm-hmm. This is welcome, but it's quite difficult to say two things at the same time, isn't it?
Well, it is, but I think Trump is creating all kinds of openings, and we're starting to see this, right? We're seeing it in response to his climate policies, of not just saying, no, you shouldn't be approving these oil pipelines, but moving forward on a transition to 100% renewable energy with justice at the center and doing it in all of the areas that Trump does not control. And I'm really seeing an increased ambition and increased pressure from the grassroots to do that because the stakes are so high. We're seeing it with healthcare too. What they're doing with healthcare is so reckless that, on the one hand, you have to say no to dismantling Obamacare, to pushing forward this vision that they're calling healthcare, but is actually this huge tax giveaway. But at the same time, states like California are moving closer to single-payer healthcare, and people are fighting to get universal public health care on the NHS model at the state level. So I think it is possible to say no and yes at the same time. I think the yes in the United States will mostly express itself at the subnational level, right? So for instance, saying no to Trump's attacks on immigrants, but building what are being called sanctuary cities or freedom cities, going beyond the sanctuary, but the idea of what does it mean to build a city that is truly safe for everybody. And so I think that movements are finding really interesting and creative ways to up the ambition while saying no. So not just being anti-Trump, but using the openings and the failures of the Trump era to advance a much more visionary agenda than has been on offer from the Democratic Party.
And your own country, Canada, has been praised for welcoming refugees. I'm bound to ask you about that other brand, the Liberal brand, yeah. Justin Trudeau. What do you make of Trudeau? And do you feel that he and his advisors use some of the same techniques that Trump uses?
Yeah, I mean, I think, to be honest, Canada's received outsized praise for welcoming refugees. We did welcome a wave of Syrian refugees. That was largely a grassroots process of individual families and communities sponsoring Syrian refugees, taking responsibility for the transition for a year. And there's no doubt that Justin Trudeau was better on that front than Stephen Harper, our previous government. But so far, in response to Trump, we've mainly gotten tweets. We have not gotten changes in policies. And we have a policy in place between Canada and the US, which is called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which means that if you try to get into the United States and fail, you can't then try to get into Canada, because we consider the US to be a safe third country. Now, obviously, that's not true for Muslims right now, but this is our major trading partner, and Justin Trudeau has not been in any way willing to challenge Trump in a meaningful way. In fact, he's done a lot of very generous branding for Trump. He took a picture with Ivanka sitting in Trump's chair. He's talked about what a good listener Trump is. He's gone to the European Union and reassured Europeans that Trump isn't as bad as he seems. I think Trudeau uses branding, social media, in very similar ways to Trump. They both really like to crash people's weddings, proms. They these sort of staged surprises. And he's sort of a master of social media memes. Yeah.
Finally, in terms of national consciousness, I mean, you speak about shock resistance. You give two examples: Argentina in 2001, Spain in 2004. But they both had, in recent shared public memory, the trauma of the junta in Argentina and Franco in Spain. Is the problem that in the United States, while there are some communities who have a memory of trauma, and you say that blacks weren't surprised by Katrina, whereas whites were, the problem is there isn't a shared collective background that people can draw on to understand how to resist?
Yes, but I mean, it isn't because there isn't a history of trauma. It's because there is a war on history at the center of the American narrative. And this is true of many settler colonial nations, which sort of, in their very DNA, is the idea of the do-over, right? I mean, what does it mean to have a large part of your country called New England, right? I mean, this whole idea of just like, we're starting New England here, right? Like, and this idea of wiping the slate clean and the new beginning is the founding narrative of the United States. And so whenever Americans are asked to look back at traumatic history, there's this knee-jerk revulsion among the dominant classes of, we will not look back, we're starting over, history begins today, it's always brand new. And Trump, this is one of the ways in which Trump is this very exaggerated version of the culture as opposed to an aberration. I mean, Trump is perennially starting new at sort of year zero with every tweet, right? Like, there is no history. There is, like, even what he tweeted yesterday doesn't matter, or that morning. It's just he's starting reality anew. So I think in the US, it's less about not having the history, because there is a absolutely brutal history in that culture, and absolutely a brutal history of using shocks and traumas. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese internment, the mass deportations of Mexicans during the Great Depression. But yes, it isn't metabolized in the culture, but that's part of a broader war on history.
And yet the US isn't exceptional. I mean, what seems to me most interesting about Brexit is that the British haven't really come to terms with the fact they no longer rule the world. The spectre of empire continues over them. And you write that the Brexit campaign spoke to the same toxic cocktail of real economic pain and genuinely eroded democracy combined with identity-based entitlement. It's very difficult, if Americans need to de-Trump, the English, if you like, need to sort of detoxify themselves of empire. But it's quite difficult to face that grief, isn't it? And is that something that progressives have to encourage people to do?
I think so. I mean, the only shock-resistant societies I've ever seen are ones that have done that difficult work of looking at painful history and shared responsibility in those moments. And what are the conditions under which we have been our worst selves, and how might we be better? And I mean, one exception I would say is I do believe that there is a memory of how much was lost after 9/11 in the United States, and I think in Britain as well, and shame at the ways in which people allowed Muslim Americans to be profiled, surveilled, vilified, targeted. And if you look at the way people responded to the Muslim travel ban and just this sort of instant flooding the airports, flooding the streets. I did my New York book launch with Hari Kondabolu, who's he's a comedian in the States, a political comedian. He talked about it as it's almost like there was a muscle memory for the first time of, we're going to do this right. And so I think there are some signs of progress, of a willingness to try not to repeat those same mistakes again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.